delighted that President Wagner is able to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I am here with my very supportive husband and photographer, Dr. Travis Taylor. And it's true that I have been here before. In fact, I think we figured out I've been here 3 times. This is the 3rd visit. I spoke in 2004. And then in 2008 for State of Race, and here we are in 2014. And I thought a lot about what am I going to say that was different than what I said before. And I was told, well, not to worry because most of you weren't here then. But I have thought about whether things have changed since 2008, for example. We have, since I believe it was the spring of 2008, so before the election. And so since 2008, we've elected Barack Obama twice. The Tea Party has become a household phrase. The Voting Rights Act has been gutted by the Supreme Court. Stand Your Ground gun laws have made it open season on young black men like Trayvon Martin and Jordan Davis. And the collapse of the American economy in September 2008 led to the greatest loss of net worth in the African American and Latino communities since the Great Depression. All of that is related to the state of race in our society, and most of it is pretty depressing. But I am an optimist by nature, and I am always looking for signs of hope, and I want to say the issues true we just saw is a sign of hope, and I want to thank them for their presentation. What I want to talk about this evening. Where are the signs of hope? And I gave my talk a title, and it is long, which will not surprise anyone who's read my books. The title of my talk is Diversity, Democracy, and Leadership, Education in the 21st Century, in Search of Hope. So what does that all mean? Over the last few years, as we've witnessed the Washington, D.C. dysfunction, I've been thinking a lot about what role race has played in that dysfunction, as well as what kind of education is needed to restore health to our democracy. So I want to start with the role of race. So right after the 2008 election, I wrote an essay about, I was asked to write an essay by a publication called Inside Higher Education. They called me up and they said there have been all these racist incidents around the country following just before and just after the first election of President Barack Obama, and we don't understand that because so many young people voted for him, 2 to 1. So why would college campuses be the site of so much racist activity linked to the election? That was the question they asked me to respond to. And I wrote an essay. I'm just going to read a little piece of it to you. In it, I described what it was like on election night. How many of you were in some public place, whether on campus or maybe someplace else, in 2008, November 2008? Okay. So I was at Spelman, and it was a very remarkable evening. We were all gathered in the campus center waiting for the results of the election. And when it was announced that President Obama had won, of course, there was a lot of shouting and celebration. But before the election results were announced, civil rights icon Joseph Lowery, Reverend Dr. Joseph Lowery, was on campus, and he spoke about what he called the 2008 election process as a transformational moment in which the United States is being reborn. I thought that was very powerful language. He called it, to just repeat, a transformational moment in which the United States is being reborn. He went on to say it was a moment in which the politics of fear and division was giving way to the politics of hope and inclusion. And when the announcement of Barack Obama's victory came, as I said, everybody was very excited, but I also remember not only the excitement at Spelman, but the scenes of the park in Chicago, right? We saw all those people, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational gatherings, not only in Grant Park in Chicago, but in Times Square in New York, in front of the White House in Washington. Surely it was one of those evenings you will always remember if you were a young adult or older at that time. But the weekend of the election, just after the election, the weekend right after the election, the results of a Gallup poll were reported in the weekend edition of USA Today. And in that poll, it said that most Americans, 67%, expressed pride in this collective accomplishment. Even those who didn't vote for President Obama indicated their excitement about the advance in race relations that his victory represented, recognizing that he was able to garner support from every region in the country. But from the beginning, it was young voters. In fact, I'm remembering that campaign, my husband and I were saying, are you kidding? He can never win. And it was our son, our oldest son, who was born in 1982, right? So a millennial, who was saying, you know, he was an early supporter. He was, as I say, an early adopter. He was, you know, out there saying, this guy is going to win. And we were like, are you kidding? What can you say? It was the millennial generation, young voters that secured his win, voting 2-1 in his favor in the election and turning out in high numbers for him early in the primaries, as our son did, before he achieved front-runner status. So given all of that, this was the puzzling question that I was being asked to reflect on. There were incidents like this one, the hanging of an effigy of Barack Obama at the University of Kentucky, the appearance of a noose on a tree at Baylor University, the dumping of a dead bear plastered with Obama posters at Western Carolina University. And just after the election, on that same night, a posting by a University of Texas student calling for, quote, all the hunters to gather up. We have an end at the White House. Those were just 4 of several of events like this. And of course, we know in the years since 2008, periodically we read about some kind of incident like that on a college campus. But all of the ones I just mentioned all harken back to a time of overt racial violence and hatred. And so the question I was asked then was, how can such incidents be understood at such a transformative moment? Were they simply, as some people suggested, random adolescent pranks without racial or political motivation? And certainly, I said in my response, immature thoughtlessness shaped by a lifetime of exposure to stereotypical images, some of the thoughtless kinds of comments that were acted out on the stage just before us are part of that lifetime of exposure to stereotypical images and cultural messages that reinforce notions of white supremacy and black inferiority in the case of President Obama. All of that part of the explanation. But history suggests there's more to it than that. In every period of great social change, there has been a backlash, often violent in response. And I'm a psychologist, as was introduced, and so I think about these things not only, I think it's important to understand history, but when I look at history, I look at it through a psychological lens. And for me, one of the things I see is that a shifting paradigm, when things change, when people's assumptions are challenged, all of that generates anxiety, even psychological threat, for those who feel the basic assumptions of society changing in ways they can no longer predict. So when we go back to that Gallup poll of 2008, and we see that 67% expressed pride, there was another group of people, 27%, who said that the results of the election frightened them. And some of that fear is perhaps related to disagreement with policies, worry that, you know, things like the Affordable Care Act might get passed. But for some small segment, perhaps like those involved in those campus incidents, the fear may be related to an unvoiced and maybe even unconscious recognition that the racial calculus of society has been changed by the election, a change that threatens the position of privilege that white people have occupied for such a long time. Such a sense of threat can lead to irrational, potentially violent behavior. And of course, the fear of such violence is underscored by the not-so-distant memory of brutality and murder which accompanied the struggle for civil rights, including voting rights in this nation. And it's the same kind of irrational threat that leads to the kind of behavior we saw in Michael Dunn in Florida, the kind of person who shoots unarmed black teenagers in parked cars, and the same kind of irrational threat that lurks in the mind of a juror in a murder trial when the shooter is white and the victim is black, and there's a question of whether there was a sense of threat. 6 years later, here we are in 2014, we can say that the election of President Obama by itself has not changed the state of race in America. But it did change something. And the thing I think it changed is a narrative that we all know. There is a familiar story, a narrative in American culture, and it goes like this. It's the movie we have all seen. In a heroic struggle, after all the twists and turns of the plot line, the white guy, usually the blonde, wins. The black guy, if there is one, is usually eliminated from the story before the end. You've seen that movie, right? In 2008 and in 2012, the second election, the story had a new ending. We can no longer predict the winner based on race, and perhaps soon not even on gender. A new and less predictable ending makes for a much better story and a much better society. But something else has changed too, and that is the demographics of our country. The census of 2010 has come out. The cover of magazines tell us that the white majority is soon going to be, and is already in some places, the new minority. Now, numbers by themselves do not change power dynamics. Just ask any woman. Already in the numerical majority, but still underpaid and living on the edge across the nation. But both changes, election results and demographic changes, create a sense of uncertainty among those used to a different story. And lack of predictability for many people generates fear. So, on a college campus, what are we supposed to do? How should we respond to what I would interpret as campus expressions of fear? We need to seize the teachable moment, illuminate the pattern of violence associated with movements of social change, so when incidents that are threatening in tone and content occur, they can be understood by everyone as in the social and historical context in which they are happening. They're not just isolated, but part of a pattern. We maintain also, I think it's important to maintain a posture, I'm sure you would all agree, in which hateful incidents are never allowed to go unchallenged. And we need to provide opportunities for speech and dialogue, more dialogue, about how various groups of students are experiencing the social changes we are all witnessing. I have to say I was very impressed with the presentation that the Issues Troop gave, and I was thinking as I sat in my seat, you all don't need my talk, we just need to have a conversation about those examples that they gave. But that dialogue, that opportunity for dialogue about how various groups of students are experiencing the social context and the changes we're all witnessing is really an important conversation that doesn't happen often enough. Another thing that's great about that presentation we saw is the power of cross-racial, cross-ethnic coalitions. A power we have witnessed in the 21st century. We witnessed it in the election of Barack Obama, who could not have won that first election without cross-racial, cross-ethnic coalitions. There is something hopeful in that, and I don't think we lift up that dimension of that experience often enough, because people being able to work together across lines of difference is really an important example for us to highlight. But as many people wanted to say after that election, are we in a post-racial society? Definitely not. But our society has changed, and in my view, the hope for more change is right here, at Emory, at Spelman, on college and university campuses across the nation. So I want to talk about why I'm hopeful about that, and I want to put that sense of hopefulness in a historical context by sharing a little bit of personal history. If you were here in 2004 or 2008, you've heard this story before. But I will tell you that I was born in 1954, and that is a significant year because it is the year of the landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision. I always think it interesting and personally meaningful that a person who writes a lot about race was born in 1954. But I imagine that, in fact, I'm sure, looking at this audience, most of you were born sometime after that. I am an integration baby. And I say that not just because I was born in 1954, but the struggle to desegregate has shaped my life since birth. My parents, who are still living, they're both now 87, were living in Tallahassee, Florida when I was born. That's where I was born. And my father was teaching at what we now refer to as Florida A&M University, a historically black college, and he was an art professor there. He had an undergraduate degree from Howard University in art. He had gone to the University of Iowa and had an MFA, and he was teaching at Florida A&M, but he wanted a doctorate. And he would have liked to get his doctorate in art education, and they had the program he wanted to attend at Florida State University, which is also in Tallahassee. However, in 1954, he could not attend Florida State because of segregation. Even though I was born in September and the Brown decision was in May of 1954, the states, southern states, Georgia included, were very slow to make those changes. And so how did the state of Florida address the fact that, separate but equal was no longer constitutional according to the Supreme Court? They said, we will pay your transportation to another school. And they paid his train ticket to Pennsylvania so he could get his degree from Penn State, which is what happened. So you can imagine when he was finished with that degree, he did not want to live in Florida. And so in 1958, we moved to Massachusetts, where he became the first African-American professor at Bridgewater State College in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, which is where I grew up. Now, I tell you that story to say that sounds like, doesn't that sound ridiculous? You take your human capital, you invest in it, and then you create a hostile environment they don't want to come back, right? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Today, President Wagner and I serve on a committee that's all about keeping intellectual capital, talent here in Atlanta so Atlanta can grow. Every community wants to do that. But in the 1950s, there were a lot of communities that said, go elsewhere. So that's what my family did, and I grew up in Massachusetts. My children, who were born in 1982 and 1986, have had no experience of that kind of direct discrimination. So clearly we know that our society has changed over time. But that's not the only change, right? Another change is really, I'm coming back now to that demographic question. They, our children, and most of you in this room, are by far the most racially and ethnically diverse generation in U.S. history. 35% are of color. Latinos are the largest group, 16% of the millennials, and African Americans now 14%. This is the first generation in which it's first generation in U.S. history in which black people are not the largest racial or ethnic group in the U.S. 14 million are children of immigrants from places like South Asia and Africa, as well as other parts of the world. Despite the demographic diversity, however, there is still a lot of racial and ethnic fragmentation, with most of this student generation going to school in an era of school resegregation in every part of the country. So while I look at this very diverse audience here at Emory, and you might say, well, this isn't even really representative of Emory, it's a particular slice of Emory who wanted to come to this talk. But even if you were to take a snapshot at an Emory commencement, or where everyone who's graduating that year is represented, you would probably see an environment more diverse than most of the high schools you attended. People are nodding agreement. Yes. The truth of the matter is, blacks and Latinos in particular are more likely to be in segregated schools in 2014 than in the 1980s or even 1990s. There was a real decline in the effort around school desegregation that really dates back to the election of President Nixon. I can tell you more about that in terms of President Nixon's opportunity to appoint 4 very conservative Supreme Court judges and the Supreme Court cases that have chipped away at Brown versus Board of Education since then. But all of this is to say that we are at a very important historical moment with regard to education and the nation's legacy of dealing with race. It's a moment that contains both danger and opportunity. The danger is we can allow the forces leading to greater segregation to drive us further apart as a nation, and we see some of that tendency operating today. Or we can use our leadership as educators or as active citizens to use and value higher education as a location where crucial connections can be forged. I like to think of college and university communities as the last best opportunity to really shift that tide in terms of that direction. In my most recent book, Can We Talk About Race? So it's a long title, Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in an Era of Resegregation? In that book, I started the book by recounting the drama of resegregation. First, how did schools desegregate through court-ordered busing and other mandated strategies, and now why are they resegregating? And mostly that is the result of reversals of court decisions and other changes in public policy. But all of this has played out in my lifetime. But the reality is the retreat from school desegregation, the resegregation of schools, has occurred at the K through 12 level, and that process is a threat to higher education. And so why is it a threat? It is a threat because both white students and students of color will come to college less prepared than they need to be. For example, many students of color, particularly if they're in low-income urban or rural environments, will have had reduced access to high-level college preparatory classes and the facilities that support such a curriculum. Many, they may not have had access to AP classes, for example. Recently there was a report that came out of the College Board that said there was something like 3 or 4 states in the nation where not one African American student had taken an AP computer science class, an AP computer science exam. And in all likelihood, that's because limited, not just because they didn't take them, but because very limited access. In the same study, they talked about the number of states where not one female student had taken a computer AP exam, computer science AP exam. But not to digress, let me just say, many students of color will have had reduced access to these opportunities, but white students, even if they are in better resourced schools, will have had less effective preparation, social preparation for diverse campus life. Further, the current legal assault on affirmative action in higher education can really be seen as parallel to the resegregation of public education affected through the Supreme Court. In the same way that Brown versus Board of Education has been chipped away by all these different Supreme Court decisions over time, in the same way, decisions related to affirmative action are being chipped away and doors being closed as it relates to that. One legal case after another has chipped away at these opportunities, and that has placed restrictions on special recruiting efforts in a lot of states and other affirmative action initiatives designed to increase the enrollment of students of color at public institutions. Yet, those of us who are in decision-making roles or influential roles of influence, can use our spheres of influence to reverse this backward movement, or at least to interrupt it. The decision makers of the future, however, are the college students of today. You, the students of today, need to have an understanding of the social history that has shaped your current context of racial isolation and the choices you can make to change it. I said this was a depressing talk, but I'm looking for hope here. And the hope that I'm looking for is the fact that you do have some power here. Earlier today at Spelman, we were honored to host Leader Nancy Pelosi on campus. She spoke at Spelman this morning. And one of the things she said is, don't agonize, organize. We'll come back to that. Because of the persistence of elementary and secondary school segregation more than 50 years after the Brown's decision, today's American youth have had few opportunities to interact with those who are racially, ethnically, or religiously different from them before they get to college. And so what does that mean? I had a conversation with a colleague about the same age as me a white male colleague who lives and works in a larger white community, and he lamented to me that his son had no black friends. And to his dismay, his son was expressing negative attitudes toward the African-American students he did encounter. And this was horrifying to my friend. He said, you know, I grew up at a time when schools were being desegregated. I got to know black kids. We played on teams together. I had friends. But his son's story is very different from that because of this resegregation. And his son's story illustrates the fact that despite the father's positive attitudes about diversity, the son's lack of direct experience means that what he's learning about other people is coming to him through the lens of stereotypes he picks up in the media, in people's language, etc. So that tells us that even when positive racial attitudes are held by the parents, children can absorb the prejudices of their peers and the wider cultural environment. The specific content of those prejudices and their targets will vary depending on where students have grown up and what their life experience has been. But we can be sure that all members, and I want to emphasize that, everyone, all members of our campus population, including those of us who work there, have come to college with stereotypes and prejudices about some other segment of our student body. And how could it be otherwise when there's so much misinformation in the environment? It's unavoidable. But as a result, colleges of all the institutions in our country have some of the greatest responsibility to challenge misconceptions and to explore differences, create opportunities like the Social Justice Week, where differences can be explored and students can start to develop the capacity to connect across them. Most of our students do not come with that capacity already developed. It takes practice, but it can be developed. And so we have to think about how are we creating those opportunities. I do think there is some urgency about this. So why do I think it's urgent? We hear a lot of really polarizing rhetoric on television, in the news, on the radio. And as I said, I think a lot of that comes out of this sense of threat. You know, the story's changing, the narrative's changing, the demographics are changing. Some people are feeling really threatened by that. But you hear this really polarizing rhetoric, and it's full of us-them language. And when I hear it, I think of a book I read. Maybe some of you have read it. It's called Left to Tell by Immaculata Ilabagiza. She was a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. I think this year marks the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. She speaks in her book of the hostile rhetoric that was on the radio airways before and during the genocide, demonizing the ethnic minority to which she belonged. That rhetoric was made especially powerful because it came from the country's leaders. Now, I don't mean to suggest that what we are seeing in the U.S. today is on par with what was happening in Rwanda then. But I do want to make clear that what we say matters. Leadership does matter. The expectations and values of the leaders can change the tone of the community and the nature of our conversation. Fundamentally, we know that human beings are not that different from other social animals. We like to think we're different, but we really aren't that different. Not unlike wolves, we follow the leader. We have a pack mentality. We have an innate tendency to think in us and them categories. But we look to the leader to help us know who the us is and who the them is. The leader can define who is in and who is out. The leader can draw the circle narrowly or widely. When the leader draws the circle in an exclusionary way, with the rhetoric of hostility, the sense of threat among the followers is heightened. When the rhetoric is expansive and inclusionary, the threat is reduced. It sounds simple, but we know it's not. It requires courage sometimes to make the circle wider. People sometimes challenge you or question the validity of that. Sometimes it means we must speak up against strident voices. But in the end, that is what leaders do. The leader has to ask the question, how is the circle being drawn? Who is inside? Who is outside? What can I do to make the circle bigger? In our society, we have too many people, often young people of color, who have been drawn out of the circle. out of the picture, confined to a social and economic death sentence because they don't have access to the resources they need: quality education, housing, health care, social supports. We do live in a time when fear is rising, and us-them lines are being drawn in a way that does not bode well for the health of our society. We cannot lock people out and expect success. As Martin Luther King once said, we are caught in a web of mutuality, and that means we must look to include rather than exclude. We must expand opportunity for all, not limit it. We must recognize talent in all communities, including low-income communities of color, not overlook it. We must set the example that others will follow. So I know that some of you are familiar with my book, Where Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and Other Conversations About Race, which I wrote in 1996. It was published in 1997, which seems like a long time ago now. But 17 years later, people are still asking the question. I've heard some people reference that during the reception. You know, folks gathering together in what sometimes is referred to as quote self-segregation. In some communities, there are genuine concerns about what some people perceive as social fragmentation among groups of students. The focus of concern may be on fragmentation of results. For example, concerns about racial or ethnic gaps in retention or graduation or other manifestations of achievement. The question we all should ask is, how do we build one strong community? One strong school community, one strong wider community, one where every person is supported to achieve his or her personal best. And the skills for a healthy democracy are being developed. So I said this, I was in search of hope. So where does the hope come from? So I think it can be cultivated. Hope can be cultivated if we remember what I call the ABCs. A stands for affirming identity. B stands for building community. C stands for cultivating leadership. So what do I mean by that? A, affirming identity, means that everyone wants to see themselves reflected in the picture, right? Imagine this. Imagine I have a photographer up here with me taking a picture of all of you. As you leave tonight, you get a copy of the photo. What is the first thing you're going to do? Look for yourself. That is the only answer to that question. Nobody says, I'm looking for Beverly Tatum. You look for yourself first, right? Look for yourself first, and not only do you want to see yourself in the picture, you want to see yourself looking good, right? So here's the thing. Let's imagine a picture's been taken and you have been digitally removed from the photo. You get that picture, you don't see yourself at all. You wonder, well, what's wrong with that picture, right? But let's imagine you've had this social justice activity all week, and every night there's a picture taken, and every night you get your photo, and every night you're missing from it. I don't know how long it would take you, but sooner or later someone's going to say, don't leave till we take the picture, and you're going to be out the door. Because you don't want to participate because you're not going to be in the picture. You have learned. I'm not included, I don't want to be here, let me be the first one out of the parking lot. The fact of the matter is, in order for people to feel affirmed, they have to know that they are recognized, understood, someone is paying attention, and wants to include them. Affirming identity can take a lot of different forms. One of the forms it takes is when we create spaces like the Office of Multicultural Programming. On some campuses, and I actually don't know the answer to this at Emory, but on some campuses they're even more specific than that. Maybe it's the Malcolm X House, which is what it was at my university when I was an undergraduate student. Or maybe it's the Asian Student Association, or maybe it's, an organization for LGBT youth. However that group is defined, it's built around a shared identity, and that organization affirms the identities of its members. Some people will say, but if we're supposed to be learning how to connect with one another, why would we want to have separate groups like that? That would defeat the purpose. Well, what I would say is you can't build community until everyone feels affirmation around their identity. Taking a group photo might be seen as kind of a building community activity, right? Or bring people together or take a group photo. But it only works if everyone's confident that they're going to be in the picture at the end. That affirmation of identity is an essential first step to building community. They're not mutually exclusive, they go together. So B is obviously building community. How do we bring people together in a way that everyone feels included and yet there's a shared sense of common purpose? There are ways like we saw in Issues True. Someone said, let's do this and work together. That's a great way, but all the different identities were affirmed in that presentation. We heard the voices of people from different backgrounds, but yet they worked together. I'm sure they worked hard to put that together, and that was an effort that builds community. C stands for cultivating leadership. And cultivating leadership is really about helping all of us, but I was about to say students. Leadership in the 21st century requires the ability to interact effectively with people different from yourself. If you don't know how to do that, you are missing the boat. And how do you learn to do that unless you have some practice? You have to create opportunities to practice. I don't know, but I'm imagining, and I am really happy to have this example to reference that we all saw this Issues True presentation. I appreciate that Issues True for providing me with this example that we all saw. Let's imagine people have come together and they say we want to do it in a certain way, but there's disagreement. One could imagine that there might be some disagreement along the way. How do you work through those disagreements? How do you, someone might say, well, no, I don't want to do that, or, this voice is being overrepresented, or how are we going to do that? No, that's not a good idea. You have to navigate those differences of opinion. You do that in classrooms, you do that in labs, you do that in lots of different places, but if you don't have examples or opportunities to practice, you find yourself being the professor or the student in the classroom who says, well, what's your American name, right? You make those kinds of mistakes because you haven't had practice. So we have to create those opportunities for practice. One of the things I like to say is that ignorance is common, but in a learning environment, it cannot be tolerated as a permanent condition. I never repeat that. Ignorance is common. We all have information we didn't get, right? We grew up in our isolated communities. We didn't learn things we needed to learn about people different from ourselves, religiously, ethnically, in terms of sexual orientation, whatever the differences might be. Ignorance is common, but in a learning environment, it cannot be tolerated as a permanent condition because we now have the opportunity to seek out that information we didn't get, and we can do that in a way that really increases our ability to truly see, hear, and understand each other in our full humanity. If we don't challenge ourselves and each other about what we have learned in the past, we are destined to pass it on in the future. And that's the challenge. Without intervention, we teach what we were taught, and the cycle of socialization, the cycle that perpetuates and reinforces the stereotypes and prejudicial attitudes that are so instrumental in the maintenance of oppression and inequality, that cycle goes uninterrupted. So we have to do these ABCs: affirm identity, build community, cultivate leadership, and it's not easy, and it cannot be done well quickly, and that's a challenge. You can't bring a complex conversation about race to closure in one evening, or in the 2 hours of a single afternoon workshop, or even a whole day of resident advisor orientation. And you know what I'm talking about, right? Too often, what is accomplished in that period of time is just enough to generate more anxiety. And anxiety often leads to avoidance. Put simply, I don't want to talk about it, becomes a common response. How many of you have ever had an earache in your life? You get them when you're younger, right? If you got a child, then you've got a child with an earache. And if you've had your own infection or cared for a child who had one, they give you some antibiotics. I always think that it's the pink stuff. This pink medicine to give your kid. And the doctor always says, make sure he takes all of it. Right? Take all of it. And what happens if you don't take all of it? right? That, you feel better after a little while, but then the earache comes back, and when it comes back, they want to give you the antibiotic again, but this time it doesn't work, right? Because we build up resistance to that antibiotic. Talking about race in some ways is like that. If you don't do the whole thing, it comes back worse. And there's a temptation to stop because people get uncomfortable, or we don't want to have that conversation, or we started it and it got hard, and so we stopped. But then we build up just enough sense of anxiety that then people don't want to do it again the next time. There's a sense of I can't deal with that kind of discomfort. But you never get, and this is the trick, if you do the whole thing, what you find is actually it can be fun. You can actually really enjoy those conversations and learn something from them, and you can actually find yourself in a better place than you started, but you have to go through the discomfort, the uncomfortable. It's like exercising. The muscles get sore, but if you keep exercising, you get past the soreness, and then you actually start to enjoy it, right? If we really want to have these conversations and have them in a way that's going to be helpful, it has to be an ongoing dialogue. Earlier at the reception, someone said, Social Justice Week shouldn't just be Social Justice Week, it should be a conversation that goes on all the time. Maybe it was Daniel who said that, if I remember correctly. And that it has to be an ongoing conversation. And the same thing is true if we want to really change the state of race. It may seem implied that, some of us have figured out how to do this, and some of us have more practice than others, but the truth is we all have something to learn. And we all can learn in that regard. And we have to support each other in the process. If we only did it when we could do it perfectly, it would never happen. We all make mistakes. But you can get powerful feedback, take it in, learn from it, and move forward. I don't know about you, but I think there is some sense of urgency about this. I think we are running out of time as it relates to a healthy democracy if we don't start having some hard conversations. Spelman alumna Mary Wright Edelman, class of 1960, is the founder of the Children's Defense Fund. I'm sure you've heard of her. And she recently wrote this assessment of our situation. At Dr. King's death in 1968, when he was calling for a Poor People's Campaign, there were 25.4 million poor Americans, including 11 million poor children, and our gross domestic product, GDP, was 4.13 trillion. Today, there are 46.2 million poor people, including 16.1 million poor children, almost half living in extreme poverty, and our GDP is 3 times larger. And shamefully, the younger children are, the poorer they are. 1 in 3 Black and Latino children is poor. National wealth and income inequality are at near record levels, while hunger, homelessness, illiteracy, fear, and hopelessness stalk millions of children and adults across our land who have been left behind in our economy. Isn't it time to ask ourselves again with urgency whether America is missing once again the great opportunity and mandate God has given us to be a beacon of hope and justice for the least among us, beginning with our children, who are the poorest Americans? That sounds urgent to me. We have heard a lot about this because we are acknowledging the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. We started the school year with that celebration. I listened to a lot of speakers talking about the unfinished agenda of Dr. King's dream at that time. And one of the best speeches I heard was that given by now Senator then Newark Mayor Cory Booker, now Senator Cory Booker. His speech was just 5 minutes long. You can find it on YouTube if you want to hear it. But like most of you, he was not even alive when the March on Washington happened. But he made this point. I thought it was really a powerful point. He said, "My father told me, you are enjoying freedoms, opportunity, technology, things that were given to you, bought by the struggles and the sacrifices and the work of those who came before. Don't you forget where you came from. You drink deeply from wells of freedom and liberty and opportunity you did not dig." I'm going to repeat that last sentence. You drink deeply from wells of freedom and liberty and opportunity you did not dig. That statement is true for all of us. regardless of race, ethnicity, or economic status. We all drink deeply from wells of freedom and liberty and opportunity we did not dig, so we must pay it forward with our own commitment to foster social change, opening doors of opportunity for people who look like us and people who don't, for people who speak like us and for people who don't, for people who worship like us and for people who don't, for people who love like us and for people who don't. A few years ago, I had a dream. Not that speech, but a few years ago. True, I did have a dream. A few years ago, I had a dream. I was preparing for a conference, and I was reading about multicultural education in urban schools, and I was thinking about my remarks, and I fell asleep. The articles I was reading kind of boring, I fell asleep. But while I was sleeping, I had a dream. And the dream was this. I was driving a car along a road, and all of a sudden the car went off the road and was on top of a pile of rocks. I was like driving along the California coast, like, Highway 1, along the coast there. And all of a sudden I was driving on this road, and all of a sudden my car was on top of a pile of rocks, like there'd been a landslide or something. And I woke up and I said, what happened to the road? And I heard a voice, and the voice said, there is no road. So when I awakened, it occurred to me that my dream held a perfect metaphor for what we are trying to do as a society, because it has never been done. As a student of history, I know that the kind of school environments we're trying to create, the diversity that we have today, that equitable learning environment that we all aspire to, has never existed on a broad scale in American society, or, to my knowledge, anywhere else. But the vision, that vision of a road we could all drive on, is a blueprint. And so where is the hope? The hope is in you. Each of you has the opportunity to make that vision a reality, here at Emory and beyond. We will make that road together by walking it every day. So let's get busy. Thank you.